The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Saturday, April 27th. Sorry about that. Thank you for joining me. This might be the last show in a week. We'll see. I'm going off tomorrow to do the taping of the capitalism course for the Peterson Academy. So I will see how that goes, and depending on whether I have time or not, we will do a show. Might have some time Monday. We'll see. It depends how much prep I need to do. All right, let's see. So we are doing our Ask Me Anything show today. So please feel free to use the super chat to ask questions. We've got a panel. We'll start with them. And John has already started us off with a contribution. Thank you, John. But the rest of you, yeah, feel free to jump in terms of super chat questions. This is your afternoon, so you guys get to dictate what we talk about. Adam already has his hand up. God. All right, Adam, go for it.
Okay. As you probably noticed, October 7th seems to have been a favor by the Iranian mullahs for Putin to divert attention and ammunition away from Ukraine. Now, what I'm noticing on American campuses right now is a replica of the standard Russian propaganda tactics that are essentially identical to the anti-Semitic campaign they conducted in Poland in 1967 and 1968. Down to all the details, and yet nobody is talking about it. It's much too well organized to be anything other than the work of a very professional propaganda organization. And yet, you know, somehow nobody in America, not on the right, not on the left, seems to be noticing.
Yes, a few things. I actually think I disagree with you about October 7th. October 7th did not shift ammunition really away from Ukraine. That was done by congressional Republicans who refused to approve a continuation of a budget to support Ukraine. The budget has been approved this week. Arms have already been flowing into Ukraine as a consequence. The U.S. has plenty of weapons to provide the Ukrainians, and Israel is not, in a sense, siphoning off weapons that would have gone to Ukraine. Also, different weapon systems. Israel is not getting personnel carriers from the United States. They don't need them. They make their own. The Ukrainians, that's a big part of what the Ukrainians need. The missiles are different. So a lot of it is different. So I don't think October 7th had anything to do with Russia. It had to do a lot with Iran. And I think, and I said at the time, had a lot to do with wanting to make sure that the Israelis did not normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, although I think that's going to happen anyway. But certainly the timing of it had a lot to do with a coming deadline. The Biden administration was very clear that they wanted to get normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia well before the election. Just as Trump had done the Abraham Accords just before that election, they thought it would give him a big boost. And this is the Iranian effort to undermine that. By the way, the effort to normalize relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia is still on hyperdrive. It's one of the reasons for all the pressure the Biden administration is putting on Israel. And they have a deadline of trying to do this before the end of May. The Saudis don't want to do it later than that because they don't want to come across as partisan. If it's May, they can, it still doesn't seem like it's favoring Biden in any kind of way. So that is that issue. In terms of the campus protests, I really don't think that there is any more organization here than there was for BLM during 2020. The left, the radical left, the far left is very well organized. Now, a lot of that money for organization comes from people like George Soros and others, and all kinds of foundations and think tanks that are allocating money towards these protests and helping organize them. But this is the same. I mean, the protests on the campuses are basically the same people as BLM. It's the same ideology that's driving it. It just took us, I think, longer to figure it out with BLM. But it was clear that BLM ultimately was driven by the same identitarians that are driving this. Is there Russian money behind it? I wouldn't be surprised. Putin is a very, very clever propagandist and very, very clever at using these kind of student movements. In 1968, we saw the same thing in the U.S. at universities, and it's quite likely the KGB was funneling some money and organization into that in the U.S. But I do think that the majority of this is the same organizational structure that BLM had. It's the same organizational structure as the New Left has put in place over the last 10 years. And they're very good at exploiting it. And add to that the fact that on every single campus in America, there is a Friends of Palestine. There are these woke identitarian groups, and they're all ready to go as soon as the police ended Columbia University. Every single one of these student groups was triggered, and they all kind of went out and started protesting and creating haze. So, but that doesn't require very, very sophisticated coordination. That is enough for the BLM organizations to run through.
Well, I have experienced Soros being very much against people like Putin and Orban.
Yeah.
And
yeah, but he's very pro-Palestinian, and he's very pro-identitarian, and he's very pro-woke, and he's very pro-BLM. He's very pro the leftist organizers of the current strikes, all of them. So, maybe this is a coalition of convenience, or maybe there is no coordination between Putin and Soros. I don't know. But I think Soros is much more likely behind this than Putin is.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Let's see. Andrew.
So this is a cheap ploy to get you, not cheap, actually, a rational ploy, I think, to get you to do some shows next week. If you're going to practice your material for the next day, why not do it in front of a live audience and make super chat money?
Good point. Assuming, I have enough material to practice.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
I mean, I really wish that, there's a sense in which I really do wish that this capitalism course was something that I was doing a third or fourth time, because then it would be, it would be really exceptional. It will be good first time, but it will be better the third and fourth time. So in that sense, you're right. But that's a good thought. I might actually do that. That's a good idea. So thank you. I'll see how the time lays out.
Yeah. Okay. So on capitalism, as a laissez-faire capitalist, how do you argue against political centrism? You know, it seems so reasonable to say, let's have a little bit of controls, let's have a little bit of freedom and mix them together. And, you know, you get some from one and some from the other, and we get a balanced society.
Oh, I see. So that's what you mean by political centrism. I didn't understand what you meant by it, but you mean centrism. You mean neither here nor there, the mixed economy.
Right.
I mean, the reality is that the most difficult arguments against capitalism are arguments from the mixed economy. That is, it's easy to debate socialists. It's easy to debate communists. It's much harder to debate mixed economy people because their whole shtick is, well, first of all, look, we live in a mixed economy and life's pretty good. What are you complaining about?
Yep.
Second, you know, capitalism is great, but it also has problems. So we're just very, very good at calibrating it. And, you know, that's what we focus on calibrating on where you allow, where it's good and where it's not, and where capitalism might not do as well. And look, the results are pretty good so far. I mean, I'd say, I mean, there are a few things about that. One is the results could be so much better. God, the lost opportunities, the lost wealth, the lost prosperity, the lost innovations, the loss of everything that we have. You know, it's that loss that is the main aspect of the mixed economy. And you can, you know, you can sense that loss partially in the differences between economies that are more free, tend to be closer to laissez-faire capitalism, and those who to be less free a mixture tends to be less. Now extrapolate that onwards, and you can see kind of what the results could be. You know, if they accept the economic principles that suggest that capitalism works best for tech, why doesn't it work better for healthcare and education? What is different about healthcare and education? Ultimately, nothing. And you can argue from that. So that's kind of the practical economic argument that you'd have to make. But it is not easy. It is not easy. But I think the more interesting argument is the philosophical and the moral argument. That is, if we recognize that force hampers the human mind and restricts the ability of the mind to function, then why even a little bit of force? Why force in some areas? Those areas are going to be ones in which the mind is being restricted. Those areas are the ones in which you're going to get less innovation and less people thinking. And if it's bad to restrict the mind, if that results in bad outcomes, then you know, then why do it at all, right? Let's be consistent about it. And then you have to make the moral argument that if self-interest is actually a good thing, good for the individual, and actually good for groups of individuals who are willing to pursue their self-interest and willing to use their reason in that pursuit, then by what criteria do you restrict the ability of people to act in their own self-interest? To what extent do you restrict that and constrain it and make it limited? And so then you get into philosophical discussion about whether people can take care of themselves, whether they can think, whether they can reason.
Mm-hmm.
Like Eric
And
Weinstein
right.
say, yeah, most people can't reason, therefore we have to control them, we have to regulate, we have to tell them what they can buy and what they can't buy. The geniuses can reason, so we don't have to regulate them. That's kind of his elitist solution, which I think a lot of people have. But so the moral argument is, if this is just, if this is right, if this is moral, then by what criteria do you engage in immorality, injustice, and something that is fundamentally anti-human, even if it's just a little bit still anti-human?
Yeah. I mean, to me, morally, it might just be me, but it's the most potent category of argument. Because to me, to say like we have to prove as
It is,
objective
but
as
almost nobody engages in it, right? So nobody is willing to engage you with it. So, for example, when I do debates and I raise moral points, they brush them over immediately and go to the practical points. They don't engage in morality partially because they have no conception of morality, because their morality is conventional and they think, oh, what Yaron is saying isn't even morality, self-interest. That's clearly not morality. What's he talking about? They don't even know what I'm talking about. And partially because they feel uncomfortable about morality because they don't actually say, yes, we have to constrain the individual. Yes, we have to subvert their self-interest. Yes, we have to act in these ways. The same with epistemology. If you bring up the epistemological point about central planning and you know better what's good for individuals and what's not, they don't want to engage in that because they don't want to come off as philosopher kings. They want to become, particularly the leftists, they believe in egalitarianism, so they don't really believe in philosophy. So they don't know where to take it. So it's very difficult to engage people on the moral issue. It would be great if we could engage. If they would engage.
they squirm out of it.
They squirm out of it, they go back to, but there's the study, and that's the most difficult debate to have because for every, you have to know the studies, you have to be able to debunk them, or you have to say whether the study's irrelevant. And it's very difficult. The last debate I did, he pulls out this metric, what is it, GDP per hour worked or something like that in Sweden, and they have better than the United States. And it's like, I really need to think about what this means and why this is nonsense. But you do it on the fly. I've never thought about it. It's a measure. It's a new measure to me. So it's very difficult in those debates to get the practical side and nail it.
Gotcha.
But he refused to debate the moral side. But there is no private property. That's the only thing he would say, right?
I think that's something that's so great about Rand is she refuses to allow you to squirm out of the moral argument.
Yep. Jennifer. Thanks, Andrew.
In the section, you're going to do a section about the fallacies of capitalism.
About the what?
Fallacies, the mistakes. Yeah. Are you going to talk about the zero-sum game attitude that's so prevalent and that really causes a lot of problems with people trying to figure out how markets work?
I will. I mean, it's going to come up in several sections throughout, right? Because I'm going to talk about the trader principle and the idea of trade and win-win, and that being the fundamental nature of capitalism. And then it'll come up. I don't think I have a section called zero sum in the fallacies, but I think it is the explanation for some of the other fallacies that are involved. Inequality, for example. So I'll have something about it raises inequality, and who cares? And the fundamental assumption with the people who care is zero sum, is that it is zero sum. So the idea of a zero sum, and I don't know how to put it exactly, the perceptual level mentality that indicates. I don't know if I can use perceptual level mentality, but something like that is that they can only look, they don't actually think, is going to be a big part of what I have to say about capitalism. Capitalism is fundamentally conceptual in that it rewards thinking, but it also, to understand it, requires thinking. It's not something that's self-evident. It's one of the challenges for embracing it, is it requires people to actually think and do more than just look.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Steve.
Hey, so on one of your shows this week, I guess a question came up about people being unbanked and unbanked, having your bank
okay, yes,
either return your money or as I've also witnessed, just have all your assets frozen.
Yep.
And I guess I don't put words in your mouth, but I found your response to I maybe leave a little bit to be desired, because if banks were actually, if they actually were even as free as, say, a social media company, I think there is something to, yes, just leave them alone. But in my experience with banks, they're largely extensions of either government or quasi-governmental entities. And this crops up in like so many ways that are like hard to see, like just like in like KYC, right? Like if we were going to go start a KYC software company, we would run down to the regulators and ask them what they want and code all those rules into, you know, our software. So it's not like there's just some risk manager down at the bank who's like, oh, it's Dr. Brook, he's a real sketchy individual. I find the reality to be far more complex, and the lines between government and banks to be very blurry. But I guess my question is,
I can't remember my answer. I have no idea what I said, and I can't remember talking about this week. So I'm a little confused. But so maybe you can recreate the question, but I agree with you completely. That is, banks are quasi-governmental institutions. They are so regulated to such an extent. Every aspect of their business is regulated. There's very little that they do that is independent of government regulations, that is independent of government control to one extent or another. So what's the question?
I guess my question would be, given the world we actually live in, like, what's like free banking isn't like a reasonable goal, but what is like, because you have to strike this very difficult balance between we don't want to add more regulation to the banks, but we can't quite allow the government to like have as much control of it. So it's like we're in this very difficult position where the bank is the one who's acting on
today. So what should we advocate for today?
Yeah, what's realistic for us to like actually advocate for?
Realistic. Look, I really don't think there's anything we can do realistically short of repealing deposit insurance but repealing deposit insurance completely. And maybe if you don't want to go free banking route because you think that's too radical, then something like what John Cochran suggests, and that is basically segregate banks into two different types. One that have basically 100% reserve requirements. And that's where you hold your checking account, right? And they have to have a 100% reserve requirement, and it can't be a bank run because they have a 100% reserve requirement, or they have to have 100% of capital. That's some way in which bank runs are eliminated without deposit insurance. But then they can attract saving, and they can match duration of their saving accounts with loans. But basically on your deposits, they've got a one-to-one, dollar-to-dollar match, right? In some way, either through capital or through deposit or through just reserves, cash reserves, right? And you could say, okay, they don't have to hold it in cash, they can hold it in T-bills or something like that, something very liquid. So they have kind of this liquidity. So and then you have another set of banks that are riskier. They can do all kinds of stuff, but they have no deposits. That is, they don't take deposits, corporate deposits, or they just don't have, what do you call it? Places where you can redeem on the spot your money. So they have to use their own capital to make loans. They can use capital to, leverage that capital and then but they're leveraging their capital. They're not leveraging your deposit, right? So, so there are proposals. I think John Cochran's, you have to work it through, but I think John Cochran has the best, most worked out thing. And if you did that, you could get rid of, almost all the regulations, at least on the first category of banks, because they're not doing anything that sophisticated. And the only regulation you have is a capital requirement and in a sense, 100% reserve requirement. So they match capital plus reserves have to match the deposits. That's the only regulation you have. Everything else legit. And then on the second bank, you just make them risky institutions. And yeah, maybe you have maybe you can't get away from a bunch of regulations about conflict of interest or the conflict between an investment bank and a commercial bank, which we have today, and all these other a bunch of stuff. But you basically get rid of, let's say, 60 or 70% of the regulations on them, and you could move forward, and it would be a far superior banking system than what we have today. I mean, what we have today is a banking system that basically, on the one hand, encourages bank runs, right? It creates a situation where the banks are so illiquid that we're all kind of stupid to have our money in a checking account at a bank, right? But you overlay that with a government that bails them out every time there's a bank run, so as to prevent it. But they won't tell you they're going to bail them out, right? So it would be one thing if they said, you know what, there's 100% deposit insurance. The government will bail out. And they don't do that because there's something called moral hazard, which would then, incentivize the banks to take on these enormous risks. So they pretend like there's not 100% deposit insurance. So the banks, so we can all pretend there's no moral hazard going on. But every time there's a bank run, like in Silicon Valley Bank, everybody is bailed out. All the depositors are bailed out. So the moral hazard is still there. And all these banks behave as if they have moral hazard and they do stupid things. So right now, what we have is the worst of all worlds. All worlds. The FDIC cannot prevent bank runs because the uninsured deposits are massive in this country. And the FDIC couldn't pay out the insured deposits if there was a significant bank run. The FDIC would go bust like that, as it did during the S&L crisis. That is the only thing guaranteeing your deposit is not the FDIC. That is a sham. That is a pretense. That is part of this game that they're playing. The thing that protects your deposits is this assumption that banks will go bankrupt. So banks, will not be allowed to go bust, and that the government will bail out depositors. And during the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, that's exactly what happened. In the Silicon Valley bank crisis, that's exactly what happened. It happens every time. So at some point, we all should scratch our heads and go, okay, the government is basically bailing everybody out, not the FDIC, the government is. So our tax money is going out to bail them all out. So don't worry, be happy. The way I think about this, just not to scare people in terms of bank runs, you should still be careful. Let me put it this way, because there is a level of bank runs that would make it impossible, as I said, for even the government to bail everybody out, right? If there was a huge. So what I would say is, think about who the government is going to bail out first. And the government will bail out first the big banks. That's who they're going to bail out because they have systemic risk. And I think now by regulation, they have to bail out the big banks. So if you have money, if you have a checking account, the best place to put your money by far is in one of the big banks. Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo. I'm missing somebody, right? The 5 to 10 biggest banks in the United States. That's what, Chase. Thank you. That's where you put your money, because they'll never let that fail, right? That you're guaranteed to get your money back. If you put in a small community bank, if that's the only bank that gets run on, then the FDIC will bail you out if you have less than $250,000. But anything above that is at risk. If you can put $100 million into Bank of America, you'll get every last dime of it back. So that's a way to game the system, which makes a lot of sense. The whole banking system is one big, crazy, corrupt, semi-governmental entity, and the way it functions is insane. And you're right. So what I proposed, what's his name? Cochran proposes is kind of step in the direction of more freedom. First, you get rid of the regulations, and then you can get rid of the last pieces of the regulation, and let's see what happens, right, in a free market. But that would be the direction I would go in. That makes sense?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of optimism for moving in that direction, though.
No, I mean, I sadly, I think the more likely scenario, and this is what's happening really, is that we nationalize the banks, right? And basically, if you look at the largest banks in the United States today, the top 5 to 10 banks, the difference, they're completely fascist in the sense that they have the pretense of private property, but basically they're run by the government. I used to have this number. I think this is true, but this is pre-financial crisis. So before the financial crisis, it's worse today. Every single day, 133 bureaucrats went to work at the offices of Chase or JP Morgan, one of those two banks. I can't remember which one. Not in the FDIC offices or the Fed offices or some of the others. In the offices of the bank, next to the CEO, there's a row of offices where the bureaucrats sit, government bureaucrats, stamping their approval to any decision being made by the bank. Banks are not private in this country. And again, another illustration of that is that when the bailouts happened and the CEOs of the largest banks in the United States were brought into a room and told, you are going to get a bailout, and here's the document you have to sign. It's basically, it was a loan. It wasn't really a bailout, but a loan. Here's the document that I have to sign. When the chairman of Wells Fargo stood up and said, I don't want your money, I'm not signing this, he was basically told to sit down, shut up, and sign. Otherwise, the regulators will be in his office the next day to shut him down. So the decision makers.
Do you think Midas Mulligan would have signed your own?
No, but Midas Mulligan would have gone on strike. And what is Wells Fargo supposed to do? I mean, the reality is they owe fiduciary duty to their shareholders to survive. And the regulators were going to make them not be able to survive. A gun was put to their head, and maybe they would have taken their bullet. Maybe they would have taken the bullet if it just affected them. But given their fiduciary shareholders, it's very difficult. I mean, John Allison signed, right? And he signed after protesting. He signed after saying, I don't want the money. I don't need the money. Stay away from me. And he was told, we'll basically come in and force you to sign tomorrow if you don't sign this. And that would have devastated the shareholders. So it's a very, very difficult situation to be in. I think Midas Mulligan was running a private bank. Having shareholders makes this a lot more complicated. Even legally, you could be sued by those shareholders for not fulfilling your fiduciary duty. Look, you become a CEO of a bank in a heavily regulated environment, you know that there's an aspect of your job which is doing what the government tells you to do. And if you're not willing to do that, don't become the CEO of a highly regulated bank. I mean, that's just the reality. All right, I could go on banks for an hour. I'll do that in my Peterson course on finance, which is at the end of May. Emmett.
Hello.
Hey.
Okay, I've been thinking a lot about the mess that is the Israeli-Gazan war. And I went back and I watched Dr. Peikoff in America versus Americans.
Yeah.
And talking about the model of Dresden and Tokyo and thinking about that as a model for Israel. One of the things that Dr. Peikoff said in that was that it's necessary to break the will of an ideologically motivated enemy by killing civilians. That's an actual goal that one should have. And so what do you think of the idea of Israel bombing Ramallah or some other large population center on October 8th without any prior notification given to the Gazans, and then saying to them, you have 24 hours to return all the hostages, living and dead, and surrender all of Hamas leaders? The bombing should be intended to kill tens of thousands in that first strike. And if the Gazans fail to do that, bomb them again and again until they surrender or there's nothing left to bomb. What do you think of that as a concept?
I mean, I'm not sure Ramallah is the right place to do it, but you probably would have chosen somewhere in Gaza. but yes, I mean, I have no problem with that concept. I think it's the right concept to have. I think if you would have done that, you would have probably killed ultimately fewer people and ended this faster. And that's usually the case, right? That they, basically what they should have done is taken Gaza City or taken some part of Gaza where they thought the hostages were probably not in, and flattened it, just turned it into dust, and then said, we'll keep doing this to every single building in Gaza unless you hand over the hostages and you surrender. Yes, that's exactly what should have been done. But I'm at a point where you can't even argue that, because people flip out and you get that used as a soundbite on you, and everybody thinks you're a complete nut. I mean, even my more moderate proposals, people think I'm crazy. But yes, that's the only way to properly win a war, and it's the only way to reduce casualties, reduce your own casualties, reduce the casualties ultimately even on the other side, but certainly your own. And it's also the only way to bring them to their knees. And that's definitely what needs to be done. What needs to be done is to bring them to their knees. By the way, I said this about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in 2005, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I remember I would sit next to Daniel Pipes, and Daniel Pipes would say, Daniel Pipes is a really good commentator in the Middle East and Israeli-Palestinians. He was one of the best people after 9/11. And he would say, Israel needs to defeat the Palestinians. And he would stop there. And then people would say, but how? And he would refuse to answer. And I would say, bomb them, kill them until they brought to their knees. And he would look at me and say, yeah, but he couldn't say it, right? He couldn't say it because it would have been he would have been shunned. He still has academic stuff. He still has, nobody can say something like that today. And, you got to do what was done to Dresden and what was done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You don't have to use nukes, but you got to do the equivalents. What's happening?
Peikoff talked about what happened in Tokyo. It was like they dropped a bomb every 50 feet or something like that and killed 80,000 people in one bombing or a week or something like that.
They basically firebombed every single Japanese city except Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which they kept for the atomic bombs. They firebombed them. They burnt them to the ground. There were well over 1 million people left homeless by the firebomb in Tokyo. And hundreds of thousands overall civilians died in Japan well before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, the deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not extraordinary. That is, they weren't that much more than had already occurred in the firebombing of the cities beforehand. What was extraordinary is just the sheer magnitude of this bomb. You did it with one bomb, and just the drama of it. That is what got the attention of the Japanese, but they had already seen every single city in Japan. I mean, if you see documentary footage of Japan, or even Berlin or Dresden or any of these cities after World War II, I mean, it looks bad enough even now in Gaza, right? Because Israel's destroyed many homes and many buildings, but they evacuated most of the people before that. But in Dresden and Tokyo were flattened. There was nothing there. I've stayed at this, what is it? The Imperial Hotel, I think, in Tokyo, which was actually designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is beautiful, beautiful hotel, and it was destroyed, in the firebombing of Tokyo and rebuilt afterwards. And they have pictures in the lobby of what it looked like when it was destroyed, and just all of Tokyo just flat and just rubble. The whole thing is just rubble. Yes, I mean, that talk by Leonard is so, not true just because of what he says about what needs to be done, but true because of what it says about the American spirit. And think about how America's attitude towards Israel right now. A significant majority of Americans now do not support Israel. And look at what's happening with the demonstrations. Look at the unwillingness to do anything. Where's the American sense of life? I mean, that whole talk is oriented around the American sense of life is dead. It's finished. And it's, if you look at America today, it's even more finished than it was 20 years ago, which is not surprising. Every decade, it's going to erode more. But But this is not America in terms of the response, in terms of the attitude. It's just horrific.
Thanks.
Thanks, Emmett. Skylar.
Greetings. I wanted to know how I can prevent myself from sounding like I'm engaging in parlor games with people when I'm explaining philosophy. For example, I had a Marine who I was talking to, and I said, A is A. And I said, it's like saying God is like saying, or saying there's a God is like saying there's a letter before A. And his eyes widen, like he grasped something he never really understood before. But if I tell that to somebody else, they're like, oh, well, you can say that's the alphabet and things like that nature. So how do I explain myself through philosophy without having it seem like it's a parlor game?
I mean, you have to, I think the most important thing is you have to really concretize, and you have to really give real world examples. You have to use stories or events or things going on in the world that they are experiencing or that they are familiar with that illustrate the point in a very real way. I almost never say something like A is A, because it's, for example, because it's too much of a gotcha for people. And what you really want is to explain. What you really want is to walk them through it. Walk them through, you're actually advocating for a contradiction. Let me show you the contradiction that you have. And if at the end of the day, they basically say, yeah, I see the contradiction and I don't care, then what's the point of talking to them, right? If somebody's willing to accept contradictions, they're hopeless. So, a premise of any kind of debate where you're trying to convince the other side is the contradictions don't exist. If they accept the contradictions exist, there's no point in debating Hegel. He loves contradictions. He thinks contradiction is the essence of reality. So what are you going to prove? How can you use logic? You can't. Logic is out. Logic is immediately gone. So, walk them through the steps. Walk them carefully through the steps and make sure that you're using realistic, viable examples. It becomes a parlor game when the examples are, like what philosophers do all the time, like trolley examples. You're on a trolley and you could go fight people over here or one person over here. Who would you rather kill? Well, what if one of the fight people happens to be your grandmother? Who do you kill now? I mean, who cares? I mean, I'm not on the trolley and I'm never going to be on the trolley. So why are we even bothering talking about this? You want to give examples that are relevant to their life or relevant to the world around them where they can see it playing out, not examples that are hypotheticals that are meaningless.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sure. Thanks, Skylar. All right, Ryan.
Hello. My question is not fully formed, so I apologize if it's a little all over the place. I've been following different news items, and I'm really troubled by this concept that if government violates our individual rights, that there's an outlet for individuals to seek compensation through the courts or, get people together in a class action lawsuit, that sort of thing. I'm troubled by the asymmetry when government fails to act. So I think of the situation in Gaza after October 7th, and I, at a much smaller scale, I think of the protests on the campuses. And the failure of governments to fulfill their actual role, their morally justified role, is actually causing the violation of rights of individuals. So on the campus, if I'm a student and I can't actually access my classroom, or I'm being threatened with violence, which is also happening, and the police or local authorities aren't stepping in, I would think that the right thing to happen would be for people to get together and actually go through the courts to prosecute or to claim that there's been a violation here. So I'm shocked that you hear nothing about people getting together in Israel to create a consequence for their failure to act. And what's even more disturbing is that it seems like everybody's okay that when the government fails to act, that the only consequence is at the ballot box, and a politician will just return to the private sector and continue to live their life. I just think that there's something missing in Western democracy where there's no consequence for failing to act, but yet if you do, there is. And I think that needs to be resolved.
No, I agree with you completely. And the reality is that that is a result of a complete misunderstanding of what rights are and what is the role of government. And I think the best example of this, which most people just can't get their heads around, and this is an illustration of that, is actually Salman Rushdie, right? When a fatwa goes out to Salman Rushdie and somebody says, we're going to kill you, and you know, and then the government just says, yeah, that's bad, don't do that, but doesn't actually deploy its resources to protecting Salman Rushdie and getting rid of the threat, then it is violating his rights. It is violating his rights by not defending his rights, by not protecting him, by not doing its job. And, you know, he had to go into hiding because his life would not be protected. The governments involved did not do it. His publishers had to pull the books off the shelves because they were being, bookstores were being firebombed, and the government really didn't do anything to go after the people responsible because the people responsible were in Iran and they didn't want to have to deal with the foreign policy implication of going after them. And then, of course, recently, Salman Rushdie got stabbed, you know, and has lost sight in one eye and lost, I think, the use of one of his arms. Now, I agree with you. He should sue the government. He should have been able to sue the government years ago. Certainly now that he's gotten harm, he should be able to sue the government for not acting on a viable threat that ultimately materialized. And you see that everywhere. You know, the government not protecting the rights of people when they allowed BLM to go nuts, right, and to burn down businesses and homes during the BLM riots. The demonstrations right now, to the extent that they're interfering with people's lives, to the extent that they're threatening and intimidating and harassing. The fact that the government isn't doing anything is a complete failure of them, and they are victims. The problem is that the victim can't show blood because the victim it just doesn't. We just don't use that street. We just don't go into that campus. We stay away. That is, the damage is not that I'm being physically harmed, but that I can't exercise my freedom. I can't actually. And, you know, nobody seems to care, and there certainly is no legal mechanism that I know of by which to get restitution for the damages that are associated with that.
So I work in the construction industry, and, you know, laws have been passed where if you fail to act to secure the safety of your employees and they get killed or harmed in the workplace, managers or executives, not only do the companies get fined millions of dollars, but they can actually go to jail. And so it's okay to pass a law that persecutes a private company and their executives for failing to act, but we don't see the same thing in the public sector.
I mean, but imagine if you did. I mean, imagine if you did. God. Would we, I mean, there's no end to it. I mean, that's part of the problem, I think, and why government is going to resist this to the end, right? You know, should Marines be able to sue George Bush, Obama, and Trump, and Biden for the mishandling of the war in Afghanistan, right? And all the deaths that occurred as a consequence? Should we be able to sue Ronald Reagan for the deaths of the 244 Marines in their barracks, or Hillary Clinton for the deaths in the embassy in Libya? I mean, there's a sense in which they should all suffer some consequence for that. If we open it up to lawsuit, is there an end to it, right? Because they're so bad, and they're so bad at everything that they do. Should I be able to sue the government for all the wealth I don't have? Right, because of their regulations, and I mean, that would be cool, but
but the consequence we're seeing today is this slow spiral towards lawlessness.
Yeah.
And that is not a good sustainable solution either, right?
Yeah, but the solution can't be the legal system. So the solution has to be a restructuring of the American government, and for that you have to have a complete re-education of the voting public. So the solution cannot be through the legal system. I mean, you can slow things down through the legal system, like Institute for Justice and Pacific Legal Foundation do when they sue the government over certain things. But the change has to come from a constitution that basically prohibits the government from doing certain things and restricts the ability. And it has to come, from people changing their view of government and its role. There's no shortcuts, sadly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Catherine, if you have a question.
Hey, sorry, I don't. I'm multitasking.
Oh, hard to understand. Catherine, I can't understand what you're saying. There's a lot of background noise or something. Is there any way you can go to a quiet place or something like that? Oh, no question, just listening. Cool. All right, no problem. Got that in the chat. All right, let's do a few super chat questions, and then we'll go back to our panel. All right, Ali says, Yaron, I messaged you on Instagram. I want to reserve private one-on-one time. Okay, here's the thing. Please, here's the don't. Don't message me on it. God, what happened? All right. Don't message me on Instagram. Don't message me on Facebook. Don't message me on any messaging app. Please, just don't do it. I never look at it. It's too confusing. I have like 9 different ways in which people communicate with me. It blows my brain. I can't handle it. I was born the wrong generation. Maybe if I was 20 something, I can handle all the different messaging apps. I can't. I can't even tell on Facebook when I'm looking at the Facebook messaging app. There are actually 2 of those because there's one for my public page and one for my private page. And then there's an Instagram one. I don't know. And then there's WhatsApp, which are all connected somehow. So don't. Just email me. Now, I know I ignore people's emails. I do. I flag them and with the idea that one day I'll get to them, and I never get to them. But here's the thing. If you actually want a private one-on-one and there's dollars attached to that, believe me, I'm going to answer you. So emails where there's no dollars coming in, might take me a few weeks, maybe even months to get to. But if you email me and say, hey, how much is a one-on-one with you? You'll hear from probably my assistant within hours, if not within a couple of days. I'm a selfish capitalist, and when it comes to my income, I'm very diligent. If you want to give me Dogecoins, that's fine. Bitcoin, I accept anything that I can sell quickly and convert into dollars, I accept, right? Anything, what I don't want is illiquid stuff that I'm stuck with and cannot sell. So anything that is exchangeable into dollars at a relatively low transaction cost, I will take. So Ali, email me, Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com. Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com. And I can't believe I'm actually giving you this email, but I've been giving it for years now, and I get very few emails. So I guess it's not a risk. You guys are not flooding me with it, which is good. If there's an exchange for Iraqi dinars, I will take Iraqi dinars, but there has to be an instantaneous exchange somewhere that I can convert them into dollars. That is the standard. I'll even take Argentinian pesos these days. Okay, Liam, was there one leftist or leftist think tank that called Israel's self-defense a genocide was the way to go? The fact that this ridiculous term is winning just shows how mindless and worthless the culture is today. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an academic paper somewhere written by some student of Edward Said in some Middle East programs department at some Ivy League university that basically called what Israel was doing to the Palestinians a genocide. just like there was some academic paper in a law review article in the 1980s, I think it was, talking about intersectionality. One university professor wrote about this. And then it filtered through and people started using it, and then it became a standard. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's one article in one place that became the thing and then expanded, and then everybody started using it, and it just became acceptable. I don't know where the origin is. It would be interesting to find out. And you know, this happens both on the left and the right. And sometimes the terms cross over. Globalist is a good example of a term that was coined by the left when they were demonstrating and rioting 1998, 99, I remember in Seattle, I think it was, against the globalists and globalization. And then the right has picked that term, and it's become everywhere. Nobody knows what it means. Nobody has a real conception of it, but it's a term everybody now uses, even though it's clearly unequivocally started by some leftist organization. So they're very, very good at getting these terms out there. Usually, again, starts with some academic writing a paper that nobody reads. But it turns out a few people read, and the few people that read it then use the term in their papers, and then people who read them use the term in their papers, and it expands exponentially from there. But yes, and then, of course, all it takes is like an MSNBC or CNN or somebody to pick it up, or I don't know, a prominent intellectual, maybe Noam Chomsky, maybe Finkelstein, or maybe one of these guys, and they pick it up, and then everybody listens to them, and then it becomes a big deal. So it's those kind of things.
To call it a genocide is some of the worst out of context thinking I can think of.
Yep, it's really disgraceful. It's stupid, and it's. But it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's almost impossible now to find anybody who outside, who's in the mainstream, who doesn't think there's something to it, because it's been repeated so many times. Any semblance of some sympathy towards Israel that existed after October 7th is gone, completely dissipated. The center now is clearly anti-Israel, and it's truly unbelievable. Q2 Santos says, doesn't the bombing concept assume a rational actor which cares about citizens? It packages all Gaza citizens into a single group. Isn't that simplistic, collectivistic view? No regard for individuals. No, it assumes people who care about their own lives. So this is the idea of bombing Gaza City or whatever. It assumes that the local population cares about their own lives. It doesn't assume Hamas cares about their lives. It assumes that the people care about their lives, and the people care about their lives so much that they will actually rise up against Hamas and destroy them. That is, it assumes that there are enough people who care about their children and their parents and themselves and their own life to actually go and if Hamas doesn't care because they think everybody's a martyr and goes to heaven, then the population cares, and they will do what is necessary to destroy Hamas internally themselves, right? That didn't happen in Germany and Japan. So, whether it would happen in Gaza or not, I don't know, but that's the test. What's the alternative? The bombing is a perspective that says not one of my people should die because those bastards did what they did. And since Hamas is the government of Gaza, they represent the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza are going to suffer for the action of their government. This is why I refuse to call Hamas a terrorist organization. They are not. They're a government that uses terrorist tactics, but they're a government. They're not terrorists. And it's a huge mistake of Israel to call this war against Hamas. No, it's a war against Gaza. Gaza is governed by a political entity called Hamas, and they're the governing body. And, when you fight against another country, another governing body, you're fighting against them. You can't separate them out. And it would be irrational and immoral and unjust to sacrifice your civilians for the sake of their civilians. Right? The only thing that you're responsible for is ending the war quickly, at a minimum loss of life to you, and so that the threat is gone forever. That's it. So that is not collectivistic thinking. That's individualistic thinking. I care about my individuals, the individuals that I serve. I, as the Israeli government, are only responsible for Israeli citizens, not responsible for the Gaza citizens. Who's responsible for them? Hamas. They failed that responsibility by attacking Israel on October 7th. That's it. That's all you have to know. Daniel, did you ever see Lonesome Dove? What did you think? P.S. I prefer the old schedule. Yeah, I saw Lonesome Dove. I really enjoyed Lonesome Dove. I thought it was a fun show. I can't remember the details now, but it was like one of the. It was a good cowboy show. Again, I can't remember the details. I can't remember if there were any modern elements to it, or was it how, to what extent was it a real kind of old style Western, or to what extent it had modern compromising elements. Just can't remember, but I can say that I enjoyed it. I would watch it again. I remember there was a sequel that I think wasn't as good. It also had some great acting in it. It was beautifully shot. It was one of the really good TV shows of the, what was it, 90s, 80s, something like that. Yeah. Probably not as good vis-a-vis production value as the TV shows today, right? Would be my guess. All right, let's go back to our panel. We're gonna start with Skylar.
All right. This could be kind of interesting. A little lighter. What are your favorite aspects of each art form? Just for example, with literature, there's theme, plot, characterization, style. What is your favorite in that? In paintings, there's art, there's form, and there's lighting. What are your favorite aspects in those, in the different art, from literature to sculpture?
I don't know, because I don't know that one experiences art as as these disparate characteristics. One doesn't experience it that way. One experiences it as an integrated whole. So I don't know that it makes sense to break it down that way and think in those in that kind of terms. So, I mean, in a painting, I love, I'd say in all art form, I love the style more than the content, in a sense, right? There's a sense in which that's true. So it can be a religious painting. I don't really care if it's Jesus accepting whatever or what, but if it's beautifully done and the images project a certain perspective on human beings that is positive or something like that. So in that sense, the theme is important, but not the story. Those are two different things, right? The story could be religious. The theme could be secular. I don't know. I don't know that you could break it up. I love lighting in painting. I love the paintings. It's why I love Caravaggio, because Caravaggio uses dramatic lighting, but he doesn't just use it out of context. He uses it within an amazing composition and dramatic composition. And then, of course, there is a story there in every one of the paintings. I love Vermeer. Vermeer, it's where the lighting is the centerpiece. But I also like paintings that don't have that kind of dramatic effect. So I don't think of it in those terms of what aspect do I like the most. You could say in music, I like melody. Yeah, but if it got a great, it needs to have a great harmony. It needs to have great instrumentation. It needs to have a lot of different aspects to it to really gel. I can't say, oh no, that's the most important. Maybe it's the most important within the context, but the context is crucial. In movies, I mean, a lot of times in TV shows and movies, I like great characters. Like characterization is important. Like particularly in television, where you have time to develop characters. So TV shows that have great characterization, I'm willing to tolerate a stupid plot if they have great characterizations, right? So, but I'm willing also to tolerate shallow characterizations that have a great plot, right? But that's more rare. So it's in all of these, I find it difficult to break apart. Sometimes I like just great cinematography and I don't mind that nothing really much is going on. But I can't say that I prefer cinematography and everything else. So I don't have, I mean, I don't know that I think of art in those terms, I guess is my point.
Thank you.
Yep. Andrew.
How do you know how the socialists are always touting leisure time under socialism is better than leisure time under capitalism, and capitalism runs you ragged. How do you think of, and leisure time is an important value, but how do you think of it in the context of socialism versus capitalism?
Well, I think of it that in socialism, there's no leisure time. In socialism, you're running just to survive. Take, for example, in Venezuela right now, nobody has leisure time in Venezuela. Or in any real socialist country, in North Korea, nobody has leisure time. In Cuba, people don't have much leisure time. So what they want is they say, our version of a mixed economy that we're going to call socialist, even though it's not, and all the wealth in that economy is produced through private property. We're going to call it socialist in spite of that. We're going to evade all that. Our version of mixed economy emphasizes leisure time. Your version of the mixed economy emphasizes wealth creation. Both are mixed economies. And yeah, I can see people, people think that that is the trade-off that they're making. It might even be a trade-off that when you ask people in a particular country if that's the trade-off they're making, they say, yeah, that's fine. I prefer my leisure time. I don't want to work in August. I want a vacation every August. But the reality of it is, that's when you ask them. But the reality of it is that, and I wish I could run the experiment. And the problem with advocating philosophy capitalism is you can't run the experiments. If you had open borders today between the United States and Europe, where do you think the flow would happen? Would Americans be flowing towards working in Europe and living in Europe, or would Europeans be flowing to America? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the flow would be almost uniformly from Europe to America, which suggests to me that when the rubber hits the road and they actually have to choose between leisure time and wealth, they choose wealth. They choose to go, and it's not just wealth; it's opportunity, it's more freedom, it's everything that's wrapped up with it. But I can't run the experiments; I can't prove it to people. But if anybody thinks that there would be that I believe that Sweden's population would be reduced by 25+% if we opened up the borders with the United States. Right? Even though life in Sweden is pretty good, and in COVID, Sweden was much better than the U.S. But so I think it's a myth, but I can see where it comes from. And maybe all the people in the United States who want a welfare state and lots of leisure time would move to Sweden. And good riddance. That would be fantastic. This is one of the great advantages of open immigration, is you get people choosing the kind of life and world they want to live in. They're not just stuck in a place of their birth. So you get all the socialists going to socialism and all the capitalists coming to capitalism. But yeah, so that's how I think about it. Both are mixed economies. If you actually had a free economy, I think. Well, let me say this. This is important. The very concept of leisure time. I've talked about this. The very concept of vacation, the very concept of going out to a restaurant, the very concept of a hotel and going on vacation are capitalist concepts. Yeah. They didn't exist in the pre-capitalist era. So to the extent that now Europeans are choosing longer vacations, it's only possible because of the amount of wealth the capitalist portion of their economy creates that makes it possible for them to take longer vacations because they make so much money during the 11 months that they can take a month off. But that's because of whatever elements of capitalism exist in their economy. So it's only capitalism that makes it possible for any of this to exist.
Do you think there'd be a 5-day work week under laissez-faire capitalism?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there is a 5-day work week because of that. That is, I think that ultimately it was something that labor and capitalists negotiated, and it made sense. And laws were passed, but the laws just codified what was already happening.
I could see it being, though, tied much more to productivity than like a specific amount of time per person.
No,
I don't know.
I don't know. I think that people, particularly if you're working in a factory job, I think you need to recuperate. And I think there's a certain mentally, physically, maybe if it's a hard labor, if it's like a blue collar job, and you need a couple of days off in order to do that. But I think we are moving towards a world in which there is the potential for a 3-day work week. There's a potential of do these tasks and you're done. You can do them in however long it takes, and we'll pay you per task. There's a lot of optionality going on. You can see it right now with the work from home, or work from home 2 days, 3 days a week, or come in on these days. No, and the future of capitalism is a lot more flexibility in how we work, and a personalization of it. That is, some people will want to work 5 days, some people will want to work 7 days, some people will want to work 2 days, and you'll be able to personalize it to yourself and adapt to whatever type of lifestyle you want. That's what capitalism would make available, would make real if we had capitalism.
Thank you.
All right, Steve.
I wanted to ask you maybe for some like reading recommendations. For like objectivist content, but that's maybe like I tried OPAR, and that was not quite for the faint of heart. In terms of like that's a very dense book. Like in some ways, I'm like more interested in the applications of objectivism to like my own life. Like I'm not trying to. If someone doesn't believe that A is A, I'm not. It's like not an argument that I'm like looking to have to convince them. So like. And there is more stuff. Like I got Don's book. I thought that was great. I wonder if you had any recommendations for, call it the moderately serious on the intellectual side.
So first, I wouldn't give up on OPAR, and you should consider like finding a study group that goes over it together, because it's more fun and more interesting that way. That's how I read it for the first time, was in a reading group that did it together. But yeah, I think there are, I'll give you an example. Robert Mayhew has a collection of, with he is the editor, a collection of essays on the novels. So a collection on Atlas Shrugged, on We the Living, on The Fountainhead, I think one on Anthem. I think those have a lot of really, really, really good essays that are quite philosophical, that really bring forward kind of Ayn Rand's ideas by illustration from the novels, because they're using the novel material for that. So those are underrated and underutilized by objectivists. Generally, I think those are phenomenal books. So I would recommend them. And you've got, again, books in there. You've got essays in there by a wide variety of objectivist intellectuals. What else? I think Tara Smith's upcoming book on egoism, permissionless something with permission. She talked about it in the interview I had with her. It is a good book, and of course her previous book on values. What else? There was Don's book. There's mine and Don book on free market revolution equals unfair. Which are more on the economic side, but bring up some of these philosophical issues. Who else has written? I feel like I'm missing something big. Well, there's Peter Schwartz's book on altruism. God, the name escapes me right now. That's good. Really
I'll
good.
find it.
What's that?
I'll find it.
Yeah. So Peter Schwartz, altruism, and I mean, if you want to go into the epistemology, then Harry's book, How We Know, but I'm worried that if we found Opa tough, then Harry's would be tough as well.
Yeah, part of it is, and I don't know if you have, you probably do have thoughts. Like I'm trying to balance this with everything else I'm like interested in knowing. Maybe like 5 years ago, I don't think I would have even asked the question, should I consume like more of this? But I've been personally wrestling with okay, like what is the return on investment of like actually serious trying to, like, what do you actually get if you really fully understood OPAR? Like how would my life be different?
Steve, OPAR is a masterpiece.
Yeah, I mean,
you got to read OPAR.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only person who fully, I mean, the only two people who fully understand and comprehend every aspect of OPAR. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff. No, but there are others. The philosophers at the Ayn Rand Institute do. Do I fully understand and, integrate? No. I mean, because every time I read it, it's like, whoa, this is new. And do I really understand this? And I really think it through. But what reading OPAR gives you is a view of how the philosophy is an integrated whole. And I think that gives you, you'll see connections between things that I don't think you've thought of before. And it also gives you a certain confidence in, my advocacy for this point over here is not just this point, but it's integrated into everything, and it's all really does integrate. I got it. I can't recreate the integration because I can't recreate OPAR, but I read it. I understood it when I read it. I thought through it. It makes sense. It's the synthesis. It's there. So I think that gives you a really good sense of understanding of what this philosophy is all about philosophically, and you won't retain most of it. That's just the reality. You won't retain it, but you'll retain that sense that it's all integrated. And if you ever need that integration, you can always recreate it, going back to the book or finding it elsewhere. So I think it's worth the investment. I think there is a return on investment, even though it's not obvious. I think the biggest return on investment is anything to do with ethics and epistemology at the end of the day, right? So how we know, and this is again why reading Leonard's is good, because OPAR is good because you see how epistemology runs through everything. Knowing how you know is important for everything that you do.
Could you say more about that? Because I've always thought of like epistemology as like this thing that like, okay, this is how we know, but it always has seemed like a very intellectual, like it'd be like academic.
It is, but again, you don't have to know every nuance of it. But I think you have to have a really good understanding that there's something real here. And then I think it does impact your thinking. So for example, if you're dealing with some complicated issue, whether you're arguing with somebody about something in politics or morality or just in your own life, then thinking about, okay, do I really understand what I'm talking about? What would understanding what I'm talking about mean, right? Because you could be wrong, right? Just because you're arguing with somebody doesn't mean you're right. What would it mean for me to really know this? What does that require? Can I define this term, right? I'm arguing about protons. Do I know what a proton is? Can I really define what a proton is? Do I know what context brings a proton into existence as a conceptual thing? Those are, in whatever field you are in life, those are really important questions that you should be willing to ask yourself and be able to, at least at some level, provide answers for. And
Do you do that for yourself, Yaron, in
What's that?
finance? Do you do that for yourself in financial terms?
In financial terms, I don't know what, but yeah,
I mean, like you work in finance, so like when
yeah,
you're
so absolutely. I mean, and I used to bug my teachers like this. They would drive me crazy. I mean, because I'd want to know why. You know, it's like this 2-year-old. Why? Why? And you know, and they half the time they can't answer because they have no clue because they haven't looked at it. They haven't thought about it in this way. But so can I define this? What's the context that brings it into existence? How do I know when I know something? Is it a feeling? Is it what is it? What is knowledge? What is it? None of those are obvious, right? None of that is obvious. And epistemology will give you the tools to do it. Again, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of how those tools necessarily, why those tools are true, although you need to have some idea, but you can then use the tools. But to use the tools, you have to actually have to study it a little bit. The more intellectual your profession is, the more intellectual your life is, the more you should know something about epistemology.
Thanks. That's super helpful. I'll give that
So I would
another try.
This way is how we know it is really good. But again, OPA is like the foundation. You can read OPA and get a lot out of it, and then figure out if you want to go for something else. All right. Thanks. A good question, Steve. Adam.
Yes, I would like to ask you a military question. If the axis of evil were to simultaneously launch, and I take it would be after the conflict in Ukraine ends, either way, if simultaneously North Korea attacks South Korea, China attacks Taiwan, Russia attacks the Baltics, and Iran attacks Israel or Saudi Arabia or both.
Who wins?
And so how can the US respond? Because in World War II, the US essentially fought only half a war in the Pacific until victory in Europe was assured. We let the Japanese take over the Philippines and Indonesia and essentially did an island jumping on a small scale until the war in Europe was won. And that's when we went all in against Japan. And, you know, from your knowledge of history, has anyone ever won a multi-front war?
I just want to see. So I'm not sure if factually that's correct about Japan. So the campaign to retake the Philippines, for example, was launched in 1944 before Europe was taken. Just that, you know, so it is true that the Allies had already landed in France, but they were still plodding along. It was still another, 9 months, 10 months before they actually won in Europe. But by October 44, the U.S. There was an amphibious landing in eastern Philippines. So I think that if the war ended in Europe in May of 45.
Right.
And the war in the Philippines ended in August of 45. It wasn't like the whole Asian war that was 3 months or 5 or 4 months. It was already the United States was actively engaged by mid 44 in an offensive in the Pacific. I think what happened, and this is what happened in Europe as well, in World War II, was there's a sense in which the US had to buy time. It had to buy time so it could ramp up military production, right? The Navy was decimated in Pearl Harbor. Basically, the British forces were decimated at Dunkirk. And the United States didn't have the kind of armored vehicles and the things that it would need in order to invade Europe. So from December 1941, really until 1944, the U.S. is buying time. It's buying time in the Pacific and it's buying time in Europe. So it engages in war with Germany in North Africa. And it invades Italy, but it doesn't do the full-scale invasion of Europe until 44, until the Normandy invasion. And the same thing is happening they're slowly retreating from island to island. They're slowly giving way to the Japanese as the U.S. is building up its Navy, consolidating forces, training troops, and sending them over there slowly. And by 1944, on both fronts, the United States is in a position to take on both the Nazis and the Japanese, and they do, and they succeed. One of the differences between the state of the world today and that is that pre-World War II, the United States was basically, to a large extent, demilitarized. Its defense budget was very small. It was making weapons for the British and the Russians to some extent, but it hadn't ramped up. It didn't have a significant standing army. It didn't have a significant stores of ammunition and all of that stuff. So I think the U.S. Army today is bigger than it was in relative terms before the break of World War II. So if World War III started today, we're starting from a better position. We'd still have to ramp up, but we're starting from a better position. So that's point one, where I think we're in a slightly better position. Our allies are also probably in a slightly better position. So let's say the Russians attack the Balkans. The Brits, the French, the Germans all have standing armies. They're not very big, but they could all take out the Russians easily, right? That would be easy. Israel doesn't need America's help to take out Iran. Israel can take Iran. America doesn't have to get involved. I mean, there'll be casualties on the Israel side. It's not going to be easy, but Israel can do it. It's doable. They can do it. The main focus of an American army, military, would have to be China, and it would have to be Taiwan. Let's say if they attack Taiwan. And that's not going to be easy, but it's very much doable for the U.S. That doesn't involve the land war. It's almost all going to involve a air and a Navy war with a lot of ballistic missiles in between. Again, and it all depends on whether it turns nuclear or not. There's one other difference, and this is a huge difference, I think, between this and World War II, for example. In World War II, the beginning of World War II, the Nazis had a technological advantage and the Japanese had a technological advantage. The United States, by the middle and end of World War II, the United States had an overwhelming technical advantage. American tanks, American airplanes, American aircraft carriers, every single aspect of war, the Americans were better than the Germans, including radar and deciphering code and all of that. The Allies were far superior to the Germans by the time the war ended and during the war. But at the beginning of the war, the Germans had superiority and the Japanese had superiority. If we started a war today, the Americans are, I'd say, at least a decade, maybe 2 decades ahead of the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. At least a decade or two. I didn't mention Korea. South Korea can defend itself. South Korea is a rich country. It has a standing military. It has sophisticated weaponry. It should be able to defend itself, even if America doesn't get involved. So North Korea is a weak player. Iran is a weak player. Those could be taken care of by regional powers, Israel and South Korea. The only time America would have to get involved is if there were nukes with the Korea or Iran. The US could focus on China. Europe could focus on Russia. And you win this. If it stays conventional, you win it. I don't know. I sound ridiculous, but in weeks, I'm being conservative. Maybe you win it in a short period of time. I have no respect for the Russian military. I think it's pathetic. I think if they came up against a proper military, anybody in Europe other than Ukraine, they would be crushed. I have no respect. I have more respect for the Chinese, but they're untested. The technology is untested. I believe most of the money they've invested in the military in China has been siphoned off to corruption, bribes, and generals becoming wealthy. And I think their technology is probably inferior. And there's nothing to say about North Korea and Iran other than they're complete incompetent and have no technological advantage, huge technological disadvantages. So I say we win it in weeks if we're willing to fight it properly.
Thank you.
I mean, there's a sense in which the Gaza war is much more difficult because you're trying not to kill civilians, and you're fighting in densely, highly populated, very, very small area, versus a naval war where there are no civilians in the background. You could bomb anybody anywhere, or versus even a land war in Europe where they're relatively big spaces where you can maneuver and avoid civilian casualties. Urban warfare is the hardest by far. The Russian new tanks are just as bad as Russian old tanks. They just have a new sticker on them that says they're new. Never be impressed by Russian, almost anything, but certainly not by Russian tanks. And here I speak of personal experience as compared to a lot of other things where I'm a book learned. In terms of Russian tanks, I speak from personal experience. They are pathetic. The problem is not that. The problem is warfare has changed. And we could do a whole show on this, but the problem is that tanks have become less useful because of drone technologies. That is, drone swarms can take out any tank. And what needs to happen now is we have to reconceive of the very idea of a tank. Russian or American, doesn't matter. You have to reconceive of what a tank should do and how it should even look, because tanks now are there to protect their sides and their back, right? So that they can't be shot at from somebody holding a anti-tank missile. Tanks are not designed to be shot at from above, like a drone crashing in from above. You have to reconceive of a tank. And this is the question: who do you think is going to reconceive of a tank faster and more effectively? The West or Russia? Who's going to come up with a new technology for tanks, completely redesign of a tank to protect it from drones? Russia or the West? I mean, the West would do this much, much quicker. Russia cannot innovate fast. So that's the biggest challenge right now. The tanks are just not that effective. But you don't need tanks if you're the West, right? In my view, the West takes Russia out, assuming you put aside nukes, which I don't know if you can, but assuming you put aside nukes, basically air power dominates. If you have air power, if you dominate the air, you win in a European war, because the tanks are useless. You can't move the tanks, but you can destroy everything that moves from the air, both with drones and F-35s and F-16s, and the Russians have nothing to combat that. I think the game changer in Ukraine is going to be when the F-16s actually come online. They still haven't come online, which is a whole other story of why not. But the F-16 pilots are still in training, and they haven't actually flown a mission in Ukraine yet. When they do, I think it'll be a game changer in Ukraine. I think until they do, Ukraine is in a really, really tough slog where the Russians are going to make real advances until the Ukrainians can fly the F-16s. Thank you. Who was that? That was Steve? No. That was Adam. Yeah, thank you, Adam. All right, that was too long of an answer because I forgot to ask the question. Emmett.
Okay. So I was wondering about careers that focus primarily on other people. What, like things like nursing and doctors and taking care of other people, that kind of thing. What helps? How do you make sure that career focus, if that's what you're choosing, is properly individually, self-interested as opposed to being a career that's, altruistic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but I think at the end of the day, it's only because altruism exists that this question comes up, right? Other people are really cool. Human beings are really amazing. Doing something that could cure somebody's disease or could help somebody have a better life is a pretty cool thing to think about and to invest in and to put some time into, so it can be a very rational career. So the challenge is, because of altruism, because we're that when I say helping other people can be cool, is that are you sure that's not the altruism speaking you on? You have to think it through. So you have to think, do I really enjoy it? Do I really get a value out of it? Am I using my mind, right? Am I using my mind to solve problems that are real? And is there a reward, a real reward to me, spiritually, intellectually, from solving those problems? As compared to, I don't know, programming and just dealing with a computer, right? And I can see how, no, dealing with people, a lot more fun, right? I mean, you can, even if it's situations where it's not that much fun, like dealing with people with cancer, dealing with people who have difficulties. So it's just bringing it back to what value is this achieving? What in me is responding to this? What is it that's responsive? What am I enjoying about it? And you should be able to articulate it just like you can articulate that as a business. I mean, look at how many businessmen can articulate that. You say, why do you do what you do? Well, because it helps the community, because I love my customers. The customers are everything. It's all about the customer. God forbid he says anything selfish about what it does for himself. So there's a sense in which any profession you have to do this. And you have to think about, okay, what is it about it that I love? Why do I love it? And is that reason a good reason? Does it integrate with my selfish values, with my, with the value of a flourishing life?
So it really comes down to what are the motivations of the individual that's pursuing this to know whether or not it's individualistic or altruistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All about the motivation and introspecting and understanding what those motivations are.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, short question. The work you're doing with Jordan Peterson for this course, his audience is massive. I'm super excited for you. I'm interested to know how you're viewing this personally from a perspective of this potentially being like a tipping point for your audience and for your reach. Are you super excited as well? I mean, what can we do as supporters to help you?
Yeah, I don't know. So so first, I'm not working with Jordan Peterson directly. I mean, he asked me to do this, but so far I've had no interaction with him beyond the first couple of emails. I'm also hesitant because the platform hasn't launched yet. So I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how many people are going to sign up. I assume it's going to have millions of subscribers. That's my assumption because it is Jordan. But a lot of it will depend on the actual quality of the actual presentations on it, right? It's not Jordan Peterson, I know, has done one course. Maybe he's done several, but at least one. He's done one of all the ones he's done one on Sermon on the Mount, on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So my guess is that I could do a course on similar amount too and
I
contradict.
hope your course is marketed right next to his in the video.
Me too.
pane.
Me too. So I'm cautiously excited, I guess, cautiously optimistic. It has the potential, obviously, to be huge. This is more than one lecture. It's a whole course. They'll get real exposure to the way to some extent, we think about capitalism. They'll get exposure to the history of capitalism, which a lot of them just don't know. But they'll also get exposure to kind of the way in which I think about history, the way I think about morality, the way I think about reason, and has the potential to have hundreds of thousands of views. And then the question is, what does that do, right? I just don't know, right? Because I've had hundreds of thousands of people watch my stuff, whether that's on Lex or whether it's on Dave Rubin or whether that's on some of the very short videos that I've done. And that's generated real interest and it's bumped me up, but not bumped me up to where I'd like to be. It's just, on the other hand, it's fantastic because I get the people that really want the content, right? I don't get the people who are a waste of time. So I do think this will be a huge boost to what I do more broadly. One of the things I hope is that this will lead to me doing more things for Jordan, or me being able to recommend other people to do more things for Jordan Peterson. I'd love to get other people from the Institute, other objectivists, to be doing courses for Jordan Peterson's platform and kind of expose people to a much wider array. So I don't know. I'm right now I'm just focusing on getting it done and doing a good job and excited about the opportunity to do it. I'm not thinking yet about what the outcome could be, partially because, again, the platform hasn't launched and I don't know when it will and when this will be going on the platform. And partially because I don't know what the response will be. I'm hopeful. This is the kind of content that should attract a larger audience. I don't really get into right off the bat, I'm going to say some controversial stuff, but the real controversy comes towards the end, right? The last lecture is about the philosophical foundations of capitalism. So that's where I talk about egoism. That's where I talk about reason as a foundation. I'll talk about that a little bit in the first lecture, but it'll be just in terms of the Enlightenment leading up to capitalism. And I'll say how wonderful capitalism is. But I think a lot of people who listen to Jordan Peterson probably think they know that capitalism is a wonderful thing. They just have no clue what capitalism actually is. They'll learn that as well.
Why are you saving all the controversy, Yaron? Why are you saving all the controversy for the end?
Because I think that it's important to build the context. So it's too early in the beginning. They don't know enough. So by the end, I'll be ready for it.
Do you think that the potential here to have an actual online sort of marketplace for conflicting or competing ideas could be realized? Like, is that something that it has a potential?
I think it does. The challenge is going to be, will Jordan attract people from the left to actually do courses, right? And I don't know. I hope so. I don't know if he's asked, but has he asked Steven Pinker? Has he asked, what's his name? Dawkins. Wouldn't it be cool if Dawkins did a thing on evolution on Peterson's platform and maybe even on atheism on Peterson's platform? And is Sam Harris being approached? My assumption is yes, that they've been approached. I'm not sure they're willing to do it. And that will really hurt the platform. He needs to get a wide array of people. He needs to get people who clearly disagree with him unequivocally. He's got me, but he needs more people who unequivocally disagree with him. I know he's got, I know Stephen Hicks, who I disagree with on a lot of things, but also does good work on certain things, is doing a number of courses for Jordan on the history of philosophy and things like that. So I don't know who else. I think Weinstein is doing something in evolution, but Weinstein is a troubling figure these days. But maybe on evolution, he knows what he's talking about. it's going to be interesting to see what he launches and how good it really is. And, you know, I can also see myself regretting doing this. If it launches with all a bunch of right-wing crazies and I'm there, I'm going to go, shit, what's up with this? I mean, assured that's not the case, but I don't know whether that's true or not.
Thank you.
And we'll see when I propose doing a session on Sermon on the Mount, whether they'll accept it. Probably not. But I could probably get those points across with a different topic. Certainly, it'll come across during because I'm doing lecture 7 is an altruism and lecture 8 is an egoism. So, and not just egoism, but lecture 7 is the why conventional philosophy is incompatible with capitalism. So that includes epistemology and ethics, because it also, if you're anti-reason, you're anti-capitalism. If you're anti-egoism, you're anti-capitalism. And then lecture 8 is, here's egoism, here's how it's pro-capitalism, here's pro-reason, here's how it's pro-capitalism. So if you think about my capitalism lecture that is 1 hour long, and think about me taking every element of that and turning it into 8 hours, that's really what I'm doing. Developing every aspect of that one lecture. And it's even got a similar structure to that.
Well, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer.
We're talking about suing. Do you think that it's possible that the lab meat people, like in Florida, that they would sue, and it might even go to the federal or, the Supreme Court, because it's a legal FDA approved product. So how can a state just say, oh, you can't?
I missed what the product is.
Lab meat? The
lab
meat. Yeah. How can they get away with doing that?
It turns out that it's like a big agenda item on every one of the red states. All the red states pass laws right now to ban lab-grown meat. This has turned into a culture war issue. Lab-grown meat, I guess, is leftist. Real cows are rightists. Real cows are conservatives. And this is the
so stupid.
Well, but it shows you how once you're anti-reason, you're really anti-reason. No games, right? So when the environmentalists and this, it shows you how close the right and the left are, right? So the environmentalists are probably anti-lab grown meat, really, because they hate this idea of science, and they're also against meat, so they're just against everything. But this anti-science mentality on the right is just like the environmentalist. And if maybe I should just become dictator, because I think I know how to do it, right? If you can combine religion with environmentalism, I think that is your winning strategy. You bring the left and the right together, and you dominate. You just crush everybody in your sights. You can be anti-woke, but also, embrace postmodernism. Like, what's his name? A lot of the new right people are very postmodern. If you listen to Bannon, he's very postmodern in the way he defines his concepts and the way he thinks about things. He's got a postmodernist streak. If you listen to, what's the philosopher's name? Dugan, Putin's philosopher. He's very postmodern. You just have to combine the postmodernism with, somebody says, hey, Candace Owen, or even better, Tucker. This is why Tucker is so dangerous, I think, because I think Tucker has the right combination. He's got religion, he's got the conservative, patriotism type thing, but it's a patriotism that has nothing to do with ideas. And then he's also an environmentalist, and he likes Russian grocery stores. He's just got a combination that could really appeal to a lot of Americans.
Yaron, what is the right's basis? Like, what do they say is the rationale for banning lab-grown meat?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's you're playing God, and people are going to die, and the meat is going to be tainted, and you just don't know. It's the same argument that the left uses for GMO. Exactly the same argument.
Threatens the cattle industry too.
Yeah, but that's they never say as the reason, because that's too obviously self-interested. So, but yes, the bottom line is it threatens the cattle industry, and it's too but in their mind, it's too reliant on technology. It's too reliant on reason. It's too reliant on the human mind. But in a practical sense, cattle ranchers vote Republican. So one way to kill the competition for cattle ranchers is to kill the lab-grown meat. Plus, environmentalists, I take back what I said before about environmentalists. Environmentalists love lab-grown meat because it reduces, what do you call it? Not CO2, methane. Is it methane?
Yeah, from the cows. Yeah.
From the cows. So you want to kill a lot of cows to get rid of the methane, and lab-grown meat replaces them. So the environmentalists like it because of that. And so that's the left likes it. So if anything the left likes, the right hates. So the right is against it because the left likes it. Yep. But I think they're just uncomfortable with the whole idea of playing God and creating something alive. Ooh, that's spooky. It's just bizarre. All right, let's go through these super chat questions. Robert Nasa says, sorry, can't jump on the panel today, making tonight's meal for our Great Lakes Objectives monthly dinner. Safe travels and enjoy Miami next week. Thank you, Robert. Michael, what forced Jimmy Carter to be such a serious deregulator? Milton Friedman's fee to choose. I think a combination. I think it was a bunch of free market economists rising to prominence in the early 1970s, including people that Ayn Rand had an influence on. It's why, Nixon got rid of the draft because of the influence of people who were influenced by Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand had a big role to play together with Milton Friedman in getting rid of the draft, but also in starting to get people to think about deregulation. What else did I want to say about? If you think about it, Alan Greenspan, in the period where he was still influenced by Ayn Rand, was Ford's chief economic advisor, and as the president's economic council or whatever, he was the head of that, and he was already putting in place the deregulation bills and was preparing. And if you think about the fact that when you change administrations, a lot of the staff are the same. So a lot of those staff were influenced by Alan Greenspan and people associated with him, who was more free market in those days. And then if you went to the universities and asked people, what should we do? I think deregulation was on a lot of people's mind, and that came through. What else? The other aspect of it is a little bit of the Milei effect. That is, the economy was horrible. The economy was just in bad shape. There was high inflation. There was high unemployment. Stagflation was the term used back then. And Keynesianism had been tried, and it had failed, and all kinds of stuff had been tried regarding inflation. Jimmy Carter did amazing things. Not only did he deregulate, he also appointed Paul Volcker to chair the Fed. Paul Volcker got rid of inflation, right? So there was a lot of positive influences on the Jimmy Carter people during the late 70s that moved us towards greater economic freedom, surprisingly enough. But, it shouldn't surprise anybody. Most of the big moves towards economic freedom that have happened in Europe, New Zealand, and elsewhere have happened under leftist government. It was the Labour Party or the Socialist Party in New Zealand that completely liberalized the New Zealand economy and made it one of the freest in the world. Sweden was socialist until a socialist government said, all right, enough. This is ridiculous. We can't handle this anymore, and deregulated, lowered taxes, and reduced welfare state. So it's often the leftists who realize and are willing to change once they have failed. The right is too afraid of its own shadow. It's too conservative to change anything. So they are rarely the ones who actually engage in revolutionary policies, even when those revolutionary policies are towards more, the so-called right, towards more freedom economically. You can go, there are a few exceptions to this, like Thatcher in England, but most of the turns happen. Mitterrand, who was a socialist, nationalized the banks, saw it was devastating, reprivatized them, and then went on to be a kind of a privatizing president, even though he ran as a socialist. So that was in France in the 1980s. So, yeah. Reagan didn't do as much as he gets credit for, unfortunately. All right, not your average algorithm. Do you already have a scheduled date to be on Peterson's show? No, I do not. I'm hoping I get on the show, but I do not have a date. Do all cases of low self-esteem come from altruism? Can you reject altruism and still have low self-esteem? Yeah, I think you can. People who reject altruism and have low self-esteem tend to either be floundering objectivists who are trying to embrace objectivism but are having a hard time, or tend to be nihilists or hedonists who reject altruism. But the question is, what is the source of the low self-esteem? And the source of the low self-esteem ultimately is not not only altruism, but it's also just a negative evaluation of yourself and of the world. It's a malevolent view of reality. It's a malevolent view of yourself, which results in a low self-esteem. Altruism is not the only place you get it. You can also get it from your metaphysics or your epistemology by having such a negative, low sense of the world. All right, Michael, to clarify the question from yesterday, how close are Enlightenment ideas to objectivist ideas? They're in the right general direction, but they are missing very, very key elements. So they get the idea of reason, but they don't have a good definition and explanation for reason. They get the idea of some sense of pursuit of happiness, but they're not quite ready to be egoists, or to the extent that they can say they're egoists, then they become emotionalists. They kind of for capitalism mostly, but they don't get it all the way. Like Thomas Jefferson doesn't get that it should apply to education as well as to every other human activity. So they're in the direction, but not quite consistently integrated, and don't have the foundational concept grounded and fully understood. James, I used to think that the prospects of another Holocaust occurring was science fiction, but there is a lot of hatred and misery out there. It has to channel into something colossally destructive. I agree. I think we're seeing the potential for real disaster, Holocaust-like event somewhere in the world. Yep, it's definitely there. It's definitely in the making. This is why highly, highly recommend to everybody you read The Ominous Parallels by Leonard Peikoff, because it seems to be happening all around us. We seem to be exhibiting the characteristics of a Weimar Germany now, maybe more than ever. Applejack, thank you for the $20 sticker. Really appreciate that. Michael, do you see Democrats losing the Jewish vote this election cycle? God. I think they will lose much of it. I don't know that they'll lose all of it. Partially because the Republicans have nominated Donald Trump. I think if the Republicans would have nominated somebody like Nikki Haley, she would have got the Jewish vote overwhelmingly. That is, the Democrats would have lost it completely. I think Nikki Haley would run away with this election. I think there's no competition. And I think Donald Trump might win, but he wins by a small margin. Michael, if Trump wins, will he be able to get another justice of the Supreme Court? Will this help dismantle the regulatory state? Maybe. Not obvious. It's not obvious who the next retiree will be. It might be Thomas. I mean, he's getting old. But it might be one of the leftists. It depends who he selects. to the Supreme Court. The new generation of what is it? Common good constitutionalism coming out of Harvard, coming out of a conservative at Harvard, is very pro-regulatory state. Bannon is very pro-regulatory state. So does he choose a legal scholar from that wing of the MAGA? Does he go for another Gorsuch, even though Gorsuch has voted against some of what Trump wants? Who does he go with? It's not clear at all what kind of judge he would select if he gets to select one. Clark, when you're a leader, your weakness is their way out. Yes, no question. Your weaknesses are going to be exploited. Yep. John, adding into Skylar's question, where is the contradiction when someone advocates for egalitarianism? Is it that reason and force don't mix? I mean, there's a lot of contradictions, but certainly one very basic one is that reason and force don't mix, and you have to use force. But the other one is we're metaphysically unequal, so equality cannot metaphysically be achieved in terms of equality of outcome. So it is not a possibility. That's a contradiction. That's A is not A. Egalitarianism also contradicts the concept of justice. It contradicts the idea of free will, because egalitarianism almost always is what do you call it? Almost always deterministic. So every aspect of it contradicts something real in reality. Applejack, please tell the story of hiring Ankur Gate. Did you run an ad in the LA Times, wanted Ayn Rand philosopher? No, luckily I didn't have to. Ankur was in class with me. We were both students at the Objectors Graduate Center in the 1990s, studying with Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger and Peter Schwartz. So I knew him from there. I also knew that he was underemployed, let's call it that. He also was working at the time for the same hedge fund I was working for. So I was working for a hedge fund. He was working for the hedge fund, same boss, if you will. So I knew him through, and I knew he was doing that. And I knew he wanted to do philosophy and didn't find an academic job in philosophy and was working at the hedge fund to make some money. So I knew in a sense, he was available. But I knew Ankur, so I could call him up and ask him if he wanted the job. So it wasn't a competitive position. It was like, no, I want to hire Ankur, right? He was perfect for the job. It was a perfect time. I knew I wanted a philosopher at the Institute, and he was available, and I didn't know how good he was. He turned out to be like as good as I thought he was. He turned out to be a lot better than I thought he would be. Yeah, so I knew that I was getting somebody really, really good. All right, Raul, I read that the Hamas charter, it's replete with venom, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-West. It should be required reading at every university to show how explicitly clear and destructive the ideology. I agree with you, absolutely. It's unbelievable, but they don't care. Facts don't matter to these people. That's what's so stunning. Whoops. Kenny, elections coming up in Europe where I live, liberals here are terrible on Islam and Israel. The right seems better on Islam, but hyper-nationalistic and don't trust them. Your thoughts? Yeah, I mean, the European right is really bad. It's good in Islam for many of the wrong reasons. It's terrible in capitalism. It's nationalistic, tribalistic. You gotta find the better liberals. There are better liberals, worse liberals, and the reality is that the best position in Islam, and many of the liberals are terrible in Israel as well. But I don't know. It might be a situation where you can't vote if you can't find better liberals. But the right, I mean, I was at a conference with the right, European right, and they are, really bad. Not all of them. Some of them are not as bad, but some of them are really bad. Also on religion. That's the other thing. They're very theocratic. Gail says, I read one page at a time or so, then think about the underlying. Yeah, that's, she's talking about OPA. So Gail says she read one page at a time, underlined it, thought about it, then went to the next page. Yeah, it takes time. This is why I like the reading group format, because then you talk about it and you talk about the relevancy and why is it important, what's the context. Yeah, the European right is very theocratic. Religion is a big deal for them, and they want religion in their institutions. They want Christianity in their institutions in Europe. You saw that with the, to some extent in Poland, with the more theocratic political party on the right in Poland. They just lost to a more liberal party. And but you see that in Scandinavia, you see it in all of Europe. I mean, the one positive surprise has been Meloni in Italy, who has not been anywhere as bad as she could have been. But I don't know if she's the rule or the exception. We will see. Clark Young, seems the left is making so business and landlords are at the mercy of criminals. Yes. Remember how during COVID, landlords were the criminals? They basically said, don't have to pay rent to landlords. You can go rent free. Landlords cannot collect rents and they can't evict you. I mean, yeah, they hate landlords. They hate business. Frank, was J.K. Galbraith a good economist or why not? No, he was a terrible economist, a complete collectivist, a rabid mixed economist, promoter of the mixed economy, and really anti-capitalism, anti-freedom, and not very good at understanding why the mixed economy could not work and does not work. So he really was a terrible economist, very, very popular. Very popular. And his son, I've debated his son 3 times now. Once at the University of Texas, once in Chicago, once in Dallas, on inequality. So his son continues the work of the father and is just as bad. He might be a little bit better on some issues, but basically just as bad. All right, guys. Thank you. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to all the super chatters. Really appreciate the support. We'll do one of these again at the beginning of, what is it now, April. So we'll do one again sometime in May. Don't know what the program schedule will be next week, but I will try to let you know on Twitter, and I'll post the shows as early as I know what's going to happen. See you all when I'm back. Bye, everybody. Bye, guys.